Welcome to POLSIS Research in Profile. My name is Andrew Phillips, and today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Professor Alex Bellamy to talk about his latest book, co-authored with Ed Luck, The Responsibility to Protect, From Promise to Practice. Alex, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So let's begin. For the uninitiated, if you could remind us exactly what is the responsibility to protect?
So the responsibility to protect is an international agreement that all states agreed back in 2005, and it says three very simple things. Firstly, all states have a responsibility to protect their own populations from atrocity crimes, so genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Secondly, that all states should cooperate with one another to assist states to fulfill this responsibility to protect. And thirdly, if states are manifestly failing to protect their own population from these crimes, the international community should take timely and decisive action to protect populations from them.
Sounds good to me, and relatively uncontroversial.
One would hope so.
Clearly you've written a book on it, so obviously not. I'm curious to get a sense of what is the urgency of this inquiry, because as you indicated, this principle's been around since 2005. I thought it was part of the normative furniture by now.
Well, it is, and in some sense, part of the story is the rapid political and normative progress that's been made since 2005. So there's been significant progress on those fronts. So the UN Security Council refers to R2P regularly now. There's more than 60 resolutions referencing R2P. The General Assembly has placed R2P on its formal agenda. The Human Rights Council also talks about and works on R2P. So there's been rapid progress on that front. But have a look around the world today. Have a look at Syria and Yemen and the Central African Republic, Somalia, South Sudan, and you'll see the challenge now lies in implementing R2P. That is making it a daily lived reality for vulnerable populations around the world, and that's proving to be a much more difficult challenge.
Yeah, I'd be keen to actually get you to discuss that in terms of the implementation challenges, how we get from promise to practice. What has been so challenging in getting to that implementation phase?
Well, it's very difficult, basically. I mean, atrocity crimes don't come out of nowhere. They're usually deeply rooted in societies or in relations between societies. And often these deeply rooted relationships, patterns of prejudice and conflict, go back decades and are not always amenable to outside intervention and action. So even when you can marshal all the different political actors to work in the same way at the same time, even then it can prove difficult to translate these norms and ideas into lived practice. Sometimes it takes lots of resources, it takes political coordination, and states disagree on what ought to be done. And of course there are fundamental issues around when and how you can use military force, sanctions, referrals to the International Criminal Court. States disagree on how to implement this principle in each individual case, and that's why we have to really rework each political battle in each individual case, which makes life very difficult.
Yeah, I'd be really keen for you to discuss that a bit more, because I mean, the sense I got from the book is that, sort of as a layperson, this principle has become fairly well established within the United Nations, but there seems to be a fairly uneven distribution of acceptance and implementation across the international system. What do you think accounts for that unevenness?
Well, I said the first thing, as you say, at the level of the principle, nobody, with the exception of Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, disputes the norm. So at the level of principle, everyone bar about 8 or 9 countries accepts that R2P exists, accepts that they have this responsibility, not just to their own populations, but also as members of the international community. And we see the wider membership of the UN criticize, for example, the UN Security Council when it fails to discharge its responsibility. So a couple of years ago, we saw the General Assembly criticize the UN Security Council for not doing more to protect people in Syria. About 150 states voted in favor of that resolution. So at that level, we have agreement on principle. The issue then becomes how to make this principle work in really existing cases. And that's where the problem comes in, because states have different interests in different sorts of situations. Think of, for example, Yemen, where the way the US thinks about the situation in Yemen is conditioned by its relationship with, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Or the way Russia thinks about Syria is conditioned by its relationship with the government in Damascus. So that's one issue. Another issue is that states sometimes genuinely disagree about the right thing to do. One of the things about genocide and mass atrocities is that they are, fortunately, quite rare. As a result, we don't have a template for what to do in these sorts of situations, and each context is so different. So even if you can get beyond the different sets of interests and different sorts of norms that are in play in any given case, you still have genuine questions about what is the right thing to do. Will sanctions work? Will naming and shaming work? Or is a more soft approach better? Will referrals to the ICC work? Will an arms embargo suffice? If we're talking about military intervention, what sort of military intervention? Who would do it? What are the likely side effects and consequences? So what we need to do, and one of the calls of the book, is we need to take a good look at past cases, at the last decade of practice, to try and work out what seemed to work and what didn't seem to work, and what are the sorts of capacities and practices that we need to build to improve practice in the future.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you're, I think it's fair to say, one of the world's leading experts on R2P, head of the Asia Pacific R2P Centre, so very much kind of an old hand when it comes to R2P. Given that context, was there anything that really surprised you when you were undertaking the research for this book? And what was the biggest surprise, if you like?
Well, there's two things that were surprising. One is that when R2P was developed in 2005, it was very much a state-based principle. So it imposes obligations on states and assumes that it's states and international organizations that will be the primary responders. Two things, though, have happened in practice that weren't anticipated. Firstly is the largest growth in the commission of mass atrocities has not been by state actors, but by non-state actors. And both at the level of the principle and in terms of implementation, we still don't have a good handle on how to respond to atrocity crimes and prevent atrocity crimes by non-state actors. So that's an area where we need much more work.
Fascinating, yeah.
The other area is that we are very heavily focused. R2P is a UN-bound sort of concept. But what's very clear is in the most successful cases, it's been actors other than the UN coming to play. So informal actors, individuals, business groups, for example, in Kenya in 2013. Regional organizations are absolutely critical when you look at sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So getting beyond the UN and also getting beyond states and looking at the range of different actors that can play a part in atrocity prevention has been another sort of unexpected development that's come out of practice that we need to build on and harness going forward. At the conceptual level, there's an argument in the book that maybe we misdiagnosed the problem right at the beginning. And that is, we diagnosed the problem at the end of the 1990s as being a particular type of state sovereignty, territorial sovereignty. States are reluctant to prevent atrocities in other states because of the sovereign imperative. What we've found, though, is that, in fact, that's never been the case. There's never been a case where a group of states willing and able to protect populations in another country have decided not to do that because of sovereignty. There's always been a range of other considerations. So we've spent a decade, in a sense, trying to solve the wrong problem. The right problem is more related to what Steve Krasner calls decision-making sovereignty. That is that each state wants to retain the right for itself to make up its mind on each individual case, on a case-by-case basis, and to retain the privilege to maintain that flexibility. And that's why in each and every case we have to go through the same sorts of political arguments and battles, and why it's proven really difficult to move beyond ad hoc responses to more systematic prevention and response.
Well, yeah, on that, and just as a final question, if we're looking to move beyond the ad hoc to something a little bit more consistent and systematic, what would be, if you had 5 minutes with the Foreign Minister, what would be the one bit of practical policy advice that you would most like to communicate?
So the key thing, and actually Australia is one of the world leaders on this and has gone further than almost every other government in the world on this.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And Australia is a key champion of R2P, is co-convener of the group of friends of R2P. And it's about making the role of national R2P focal point an active policy-making role. So more than 60 governments now have a senior official whose responsibility is to look after R2P. And Australia is one of those. But at the moment, that role is largely diplomatic and not operational. What needs to happen is that role needs to become operational. Those governments need to have a strategy in place for identifying atrocity risks, providing advice on what can be done to mitigate those risks or build national resilience, for example, through aid programming, to anticipate threats before they come and bring those considerations to the policy-making table. That's not to say that those considerations will always prevail, because governments and foreign policies have multiple competing interests and agendas, but that the minister is made aware of the risks, that opportunities are identified and exploited and options presented, so we don't walk in blindly. And an example of blindness would be, for example, Australia and other countries' response to the 2017 crisis in Rakhine State in Myanmar, where the risks really weren't anticipated early enough, where a lot of governments were still in conflict prevention mode or supporting democratization mode, and really only after the entire Rohingya population had been displaced from their homes was it recognized actually this was not just an atrocity crime, but probably genocide as well, and a different sort of response should have been moved. So only at that point did policy start to shift, and what we need to do is bring that upstream so that advice is getting into policy earlier.
It's really fascinating stuff, as your work always is, but I particularly like the policy take-home. It's always good to have that engagement and impact, as we all know. Look, I could talk to you about this for hours, Alex. Our time is up, though, but thank you so much for joining us on Research in Profile, and congratulations again on the latest book.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.